All human progress depends on heresy. It depends on somebody saying no. In a progressive country, change is inevitable. The question is, what sort of change? Is it change in accordance with the traditions of the country? Good. Is it change in accordance with the principles of international liberalism? Bad. And it's that international liberalism which is the catastrophe from which we are suffering. Again, we're the only country to have had a full radical revolution, the revolution of the 17th century, and to have decided to reverse it without foreign intervention. Facts are conservative. The reality is conservative. We've got to persuade everybody else of the fact. Well, let me tell you, actually, as I was saying to the table at which I was sitting, where we had a fascinating, quick exchange of ideas, let me tell you what I'm doing, because that's always the best test. The one good thing about Marx was his notion that thought and activity should actually have some connection with each other, which seems to me to be, of course, is academically a revolutionary thought, but there we are. It would involve people getting off their backsides, wouldn't it? But I had a sort of revelation. If I look at my own academic career as a Tudor historian before I became a popular historian, by the way, that's a very revealing term. My colleagues, of course, used it in bitter contempt as they were driving around in Trabants, and I had the same car as Princess Diana at that time. They got very jealous, and I pointed out to them that being a popular historian is probably better than being an unpopular historian, but there we are. But even before then, when I was simply an academic historian, I made waves because I challenged my great teacher, Sir Geoffrey Elton, on his absurd interpretation of the Tudor period as one which depersonalized monarchy. Can you imagine a completely madder notion than that the monarch ceases to be directly politically active under the reign of Henry VIII, of all people? And yet it swept the academic board. Academic madness has been going on for a very, very long time. It's simply taken a different shape. That's all that's happened. So I've always seen myself. There are two different ways of describing this. There's, again, the modern sneer, which is to call you a contrarian. My other view is that you are simply a radical thinker, that you are capable of challenging received assumptions. Because, ladies and gentlemen, and I don't think I need to tell you, and I certainly don't need to tell Ezra, all human progress depends on heresy. It depends on somebody saying no, on somebody saying the commonly accepted view is wrong. Be it the disintegration of the Ptolemaic universe to the realization that not even not even the great constructs of the late 17th century, which the buildings that we're surrounded by are a testament to that extraordinary world of Newtonian physics, and whatever the late 17th century, the building right next door to us, is one of the great churches erected by a pupil of Wren who was associated with this extraordinary mathematical revolution. But then, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, we realize that Newtonian physics is only a partial explanation, and it goes on and on and on. So I had another revelation, and again, it makes one sound a little religious. Well, there is an element of religion in my background. I was brought up as a Quaker. I rejected it passionately because it seemed to me to be a form of sloppy thinking. But it had one enormous virtue, which was it didn't respect persons. And this seems to me to be fundamentally important. It's a religion which, at least in theory, a religious sect, which in theory rejected authority. And I have had a similar breakthrough in my understanding of contemporary Britain. So, ladies and gentlemen, rather than my trying to give you a kind of little bit of this and a little bit of that, what I'll do is I will summarize the thesis, which, if you look online, has now actually become known as the Starkey Thesis. It's summarized as the campaign for the great repeal and restoration of the legislation passed under the Blair and Brown governments from 1997 to 2010. And I think describing what's wrong and how it's gone wrong, we can then in our discussion use that as a series of pegs. Do you all take my point? So let's actually begin. But let's begin with a whole series of things. Let's begin, first of all, with a quick indication of what actually has gone wrong with Britain and why there is a terrible sense of the country being broken, the widespread sense of dispossession, the nostalgia for wanting our country back, the feeling that all the political parties have actually failed to answer their proper democratic function, and so on. And above all, I would all think, would anybody be offended here if I called you a conservative? No. You would, right? What are you? You're a libertarian. Right? No. But you wouldn't be too offended. You wouldn't be too offended, would you? You wouldn't get up and walk out. You wouldn't try to cancel me, would you? Kind chap, kind chap. Great. Well, it's a problem, of course. What I've described now is present more or less throughout the Anglosphere, right? The situation is true more or less throughout the Anglosphere. But it obviously assumes a different form in each of the countries of the Anglosphere, though with common themes. Anybody who's familiar with my work will know that one of my more famous sayings is, all bad ideas are French. Without a single exception, every bad idea is French, but they're made worse by America. Because what happens is these mad ideas go to American universities and get American fanaticism, the poison of American race relations, and American money and power put behind them. Right. Let's then begin with the problem of calling yourself conservative. What is conservatism? Well, it begins in Britain. The word is first used as a political title in Britain. Does anybody, you're clearly a very well-informed group. It's a good idea to keep you awake by involving you in what I'm saying. Does anybody actually know roughly when the word is first used, under which circumstances, and by whom? No, Burke doesn't act. No, you're very warm. Obviously, what we think of as conservatism is a response to the French Revolution. In one sense, is a response to the French Revolution. I won't actually argue, but I won't have time to discuss it with you completely. In fact, the conservative tradition in England goes back to Magna Carta. If you actually look, there are two Magna Cartas. The first Magna Carta, which you've all heard of 1215, is a catastrophic document. It's also, by the way, the result of French intervention, so that makes it even worse. But it's a disastrous document that would have turned England into a fractious aristocratic republic. But what then happens is all the radical Republican clauses are scrapped by our first great conservative statesman, William the Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, and you reissue it in 1216 in a completely conservative form in which you take all the radical stuff out. But you don't say you've scrapped it. You do that most English of things. You refer it to a committee, which never ever reports. So it's masterly. You keep all the good bits. And in other words, and each, again, we're the only country to have had a full radical revolution, the revolution of the 17th century, and to have decided to reverse it without foreign intervention. This is an astonishing fact. So I think there's a conservative bias. But in terms of the formation of the ideas of conservatism, absolutely right, Edmund Burke. But Burke is a Whig. He's the other party, he's the radical party. And remember, Burke was a supporter of the American Revolution. So the formulation comes a bit later. It comes, any other ideas? It's Sir Robert Peel. Sir Robert Peel, the great early 19th century Prime Minister, the man who invents our police force. You may remember that extraordinary notion of policing by consent, rather than by weapons. And we'll investigate how that ties in with some of the ideas I want to discuss. Peel comes up with this idea in 1834, 1835. And the point to remember is, it is an acceptance of radical change. Conservatism, rather than the old Tory party, which had been about the divine right monarchy, the absolute importance of everybody belonging to the Church of England, the Episcopalian Church of England and whatever, is abandoned in 1832 with the Great Reform Act of 1832. And so what Peel does to reconstruct the Tory party, which is obviously broken by this, it's failed. All the things that it believed in 2 years went. What do? He begins by acknowledging change has happened and cannot be undone. The problem then becomes, having accepted cataclysmic change, how do you stop any other kind of change? And you can see that conservatism has always straddled this position. It lacks a clear intellectual foundation. This seems to be this is what Hayek says. I'm sure you're all familiar with the great Friedrich Hayek. The end of the last chapter of his Constitution of Liberty. This is the book, by the way, which legend says Margaret Thatcher kept in her handbag. It must have been an even bigger handbag than it's supposed to have been, and it's supposed to have slapped down on the table in the conservative whatever it was called. I can't remember. Conservative policy. Something or another. Anyway, run by all the wets like Chris Patton, slammed this thing down on the table and said, this is what we believe. But there is a problem. The last chapter says why I am not a conservative. And he says it's intellectually incoherent. And it's true. So the problem with conservatism has always been, how far do you accept change? In other words, it's the attempted adaptation of the human desire, all the things that Burke talks about for the sense of belonging, location, the idea of family, of the little platoons, the sense of place, the stuff that Roger Scruton writes about so vigorously. How do you adapt those into a workable politics in a rapidly modernizing world? That's the challenge. And it usually fails. Let's be quite truthful. The only person who has come up with a clear and logical formation is the other great figure in the foundation of the Conservative Party, Disraeli. This extraordinary figure, the converted Jew, it was his father who converted, Benjamin Disraeli. And Disraeli was Peel's great opponent in the 1830s and particularly through to the 1840s. He comes up with a phrase that many of us will feel a little tingle up our spine. Conservatism is an organized hypocrisy. That's the origin of the phrase. That's the origin of the phrase. That it is people who proclaim themselves conservative doing liberal things, which applies to so much of the history of conservatism. But Disraeli's got the answer. He says, in a country, a progressive country like Britain, and remember, with all the fact that it's conservative, Britain is the country that invents modernity. Are we all clear on this? The modern world is invented where you are now. Quite simply, are you taking them to Greenwich? No. When you come back to London, go and look in the Painted Hall at Greenwich. This is the old Naval College, and it's built to give proper retirement home. It's equivalent to the Chelsea pensioners for the army. It was built for the retired and injured and invalided out sailors and pensioned off sailors of the Royal Navy. But it's built on a much more splendid scale than Chelsea. Chelsea is quite modest, elegant red brick, but Greenwich is this magnificent structure. It's one of the great palaces of Europe, but built up to accommodate penniless pensioners. It's a very striking reflection of a monarchy that didn't build palaces, but this sort of great public statement. But what the Great Hall is, it's an exposition of the new monarchy of England after 1689, after the dethronement of James II, the so-called abdication of James II, and the creation of the parliamentary monarchy. But what it shows you is military triumph. It's William III. I was saying about bad ideas being French. It's William III putting his foot on the neck of Louis XIV, who squirms beneath his foot. But it's showing you that military triumph is grounded in science, agriculture, technology, and progress. It's an astonishing picture. And it's not only English people who appear there. The great Italians, Galileo, Michelangelo, all appear there. So it's this sense, it's the awareness which Voltaire had of the world changing in the last quarter of the 17th century in England first, and then after 1707 with union with Scotland, Britain. So this idea of Britain as a progressive country, and Disraeli puts it like this: in a progressive country, change is inevitable. The question is, what sort of change? Is it change in accordance with the traditions of the country? Good. Is it change? And he's saying this in 1872. Is it change in accordance with the principles of international liberalism? Bad. And it's that international liberalism which is the catastrophe from which we are suffering. And we've got to realize this. And so the whole point of this is that repeatedly, in terms of do we resist, do we accept, the Conservative Party in Britain, as elsewhere, has got it catastrophically wrong. It got it catastrophically wrong, arguably, under Peel himself. You could make it from the point of view of party politics with his decision to repeal the Corn Laws. The Tory party was out of office for the whole, in a serious way, for 30 years. From the 1830s to the 1870s, and then, of course, reconstructed, it becomes the dominant political party right through to its present near demise. But repeatedly, it's got it wrong. I won't investigate the earlier 20th century, but if you look, the person that we normally regard as the greatest Conservative leader, although he always called himself a liberal, that's to say Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a great, if not the greatest, war leader. He was a catastrophic peacetime prime minister. His decision in 1951, admittedly, he is old, he is tired, he is sick, all of those things. His decision in 51 not to undo what the Attlee government had done from 45 to 51, when it fully socializes Britain. If you think about it, the sheer madness of constructing an unfunded welfare state and NHS on the back of a bankrupt, broken wartime economy is deranged. Completely deranged. And one could argue we've never recovered from it. But what happens after 51 is that when the Conservatives return to power, they don't do anything conservative. Instead, you will all be familiar with the modern term, the uniparty, right? In other words, the idea that right and left, in fact, don't really exist anymore in terms of the established parties, and they do pretty much the same thing. That was exactly the case from 51 to 1973. There was even a name for it. It was called Buckscalism, named after Rab Butler, the conservative radical, and named after, just to give you an idea, conservative radical, what a preposterous term, and Hugh Gateskill, the conservative Labour, the conservative socialist, the two of them having effectively identical politics of Keynesian economics, prices and incomes policies, heavy state regulation, nationalization, large-scale public house building, public housing building, all of that sort of stuff. And it's only with the crisis of the Heath government in the early 1970s that this breaks down, and we have what we all know about, which is the rise of Margaret Thatcher. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Thatcher's election to the leadership of the Conservative Party. And ladies and gentlemen, in Britain, and I think throughout the world, we need to understand we're actually reliving the 1970s. This extraordinary sense of disintegration is precisely that of the 1970s, with the Middle East again being a focus of it. Then it was a Six-Day War and all the rest of it. What happens in 75 is the election of Margaret Thatcher. What happened the previous 2 years, 73, 74, is more important. It is, we've already been talking about religion, it is the Damascene conversion. Many of you here, some of you here at least, I think, will know exactly who experienced the Damascene conversion, the original Damascene conversion. It's the Damascene conversion of Sir Keith Joseph, who writes an essay in which he says, I'd call myself a conservative. I hadn't been a conservative. I'd been a member of conservative cabinets which had done absolutely nothing conservative. And that's the moment at which you get Thatcher and Keith Joseph realizing you had to reverse the policies, the joint policies that have been pursued since 1945. You had to reintroduce monetarist economics. You got to abandon Keynesianism. You got to bring inflation under control. You got to break the trade unions. In other words, negatives. You had to undo. And that becomes the and of course you get exactly the same, because our politics move very much in parallel. You get exactly the same in the United States of America with Reagan, the Thatcher and Reagan operating very much together, save over things like Grenada, when they really operated rather against each other, but never mind. And you get that dominance of free market economics running right forward. And the figure very much in the news now, the odious, but rather lovable, I'm quite fond of him really, Peter Mandelson, typifies this. You may remember Mandelson professed himself completely happy, and it's an interesting choice of words, with people being filthy rich. That wonderful sense, providing they paid their taxes. And we all thought, and Margaret Thatcher herself thought, that when Tony Blair came to power and Mandelson proclaimed, and apparently Gordon Brown acted upon that idea, it was a great sign that even the left had bowed before free market economics. But ladies and gentlemen, what Thatcher did not fully realize in retrospect, she actually understood better than most, was that something much more radical happens in 1997. Blair, and I think it's largely Brown behind him, take an absolutely fundamental decision to change Britain radically. The phrase they use, and it's, I remember at the time, and also I did not understand this at the time, and it's very important we register this. History works retrospectively. There's that phrase in Hegel that the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. You only understand things. T.S. Eliot puts it more clearly, only in retrospection, selection, can you say that was the day. But it's now clear that when Blair said, we all laughed, he said we're a new country, except he said it with a glottal stop, that we're, the oldest political community in Europe was a new country. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen? He was right. He made it one. And of course, with the shifts in immigration policy, he even changed the population. He even gave it a new population. But let's actually look what the fundamental principle, and this seems to me to be something that applies throughout the Anglosphere. All the things that I'm saying now are particularly focused here, but they apply throughout the Anglosphere. What was the central principle of what Blair and Brown did? Why was it so fundamental? And why did it challenge the entire notion of Anglo-Saxon self-government, which is the key legacy? You know, if Britain is wiped, as it may well be, from history in the next 50 years, one thing will stand out. It was the country that embodied and invented the idea of self-government. And that seems to me its fundamental legacy. But what Blair and Brown did was fundamentally challenge and undo that idea, which is why we're in fact now sitting not simply in social wreckage, but in political wreckage. We're sitting in a wrecked political landscape. And I think that's true throughout the Anglosphere, but you can see it so very, very, as always, it's Britain that leads. You know, we led out the way into the Industrial Revolution, we lead the way out, and the First Industrial Revolution, and so on. It's Britain who leads. Let's now just quickly try to summarize. We referred to Magna Carta already. What is peculiar about the Anglo-Saxon polity that develops from Magna Carta? I think it's got two essential features, and they're both represented in that one institution, this extraordinary thing called Parliament, this strange Anglo-Norman word that has now become universal throughout the world for a representative assembly. Remember, the French Parlement is not the same thing. A Parlement is a law court. In the Ancien Régime France, it's the law court, the equivalent of Parliament of the Estates General or the particular État of a province. Right, so what was the key idea of Parliament as it develops from Magna Carta, as it develops from the Magna Carters? There are actually a decade's worth of them up to 1226. What is the two central ideas? The first is the fundamental idea that the governors answer to the governed, that there's an idea of responsible government. And remember, it's not democratic. Democracy is a very late arrival. In Britain does not become democratic only 100 years ago with the franchise for women. That even the skilled worker is not, skilled male worker is not enfranchised until the 1860s. So it's very late in the process. What's remarkable is, because of this idea of representation, you could adopt the historic constitution to the democratic revolution uniquely in Europe. Elsewhere in Europe, you had to tear down the Ancien Régime to do it. Here in Britain, it could be done adaptively. In other words, when the Chartists are revolting in the 1830s and 40s, they're not wanting to tear down Parliament, they're wanting a seat in Parliament. When the suffragettes campaign and, commit the most staggering crimes, they are not doing it to pull down Parliament or pull down the establishment. They want to join the bloody thing. So there's this idea then of representative government, and then there's another idea of what law is. Law is something you make yourself. Law is a thing which is made by the national community for itself. Law in Parliament binding everybody, because everybody is present in Parliament either in person, the king, the nobility, the bishops, the judges and so on, or the representatives of the local communities, of the counties of the towns, the knights of the shire and the burgesses of the towns, elected then as now by the electorate. And that idea of law as made locally by the community for itself, that's of course the basis of why Peel is able to think of the idea of policing by consent, because the laws are yours. They're not something that's imposed, as they were, for example, by the imperial government in Ireland, which is why Ireland is notoriously lawless still, or by an absolute monarchy, as in France, which is why the French, when you're told to pay your taxes, you shrug your shoulders. It's a completely different attitude. The Anglo-Saxon view, the strong view of law. Why people constantly say, why do the British enforce you in the EU? Why do they enforce European laws so rigorously? Why we in Europe, we just go, ooh. It is because there's a completely different attitude to the process of lawmaking. Blair hates all that. Blair and Brown are determined to Europeanize Britain, and what they do is they deliberately set in train a double process by which you remove power from Parliament and elected representatives. Now, I am not a fool. I do not think that elected representatives are the best of people, the most intelligent of people, the most honest of people. They have a single utility. You can get rid of the buggers. Yes. That's the only reason that it actually works. Experts you can't get rid of, lawyers you can't get rid of. And unfortunately, or rather, quite deliberately, what Blair and Brown did was deliberately to shift power away from elected representatives, members of Parliament, to the point at which our Parliament is now just a charade. It controls almost no actual power. And they shift it in two directions. And again, it's very interesting. It corresponds, I'm sure many of you are, because you're all obviously interested in politics, you'll be familiar that the real origins of our politics are not, and this can be a nice debating point, are not, as people like Tom Holland says, Christianity. How on earth could a notion of government by debate be the object of a revealed religion? It's an absurd idea. But our politics are the result of the Greeks and the Romans. They are classical in origin, combined with folk customs of these strange German tribes that wander around the shores of the North Sea. But there are two great Greek political traditions. There's the Platonic and there's the Aristotelian. And Britain is the ultra-Aristotelian country. Plato has this completely different view. Government is the responsibility of the expert. And you rule by means of a lie, you rule by means of a noble lie that reconciles people to the idea that the different social classes are actually intended to be superior and inferior to each other. Aristotle, on the other hand, is one of the great parables. All the best thought takes, again, my indebtedness, on the other hand, to much aspects of Jesus's evangelizing. So much great thought is best expressed by a parable, by a story. And Aristotle's description of how politics should work is a story. It's a story of what we've just been doing now. It's a story of eating. And what he says is, the judge of the quality of a meal is not the cook, it's the eater. In other words, not the governor, but the governed. And that seems to me to be an absolutely fundamental understanding. But unfortunately, Blair and Brown are total Platonists. So what happens in Britain, and this is true right throughout the Anglosphere, huge amounts of power are deliberately given to expert committees. In Britain, we call them quangos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations. Beginning, the typical example is the role of central banks in setting interest rates, subject to absolutely no form of democratic control. The current struggle between Jerome Powell as chairman of the Federal Reserve and Trump. We've had exactly the same problems here with the gross mismanagement of the Bank of England since its complete political independence in 1998, the absolute debauching of our currency, spectacular mis-selling of public debt, and so on. But if you want an idea, and by the way, in Britain there are 444 of these bodies that control 1/3 of state expenditure. That's pushing £500 billion a year with no form of public scrutiny whatever. Nobody can remove them. It is completely extraordinary. But if you want a model of why, and again, you see, the problem is the left has captured discourse. The idea that experts should have power, particularly in a technologically complex age, sounds so spot on, doesn't it? But if you always, again, use a specific model, the problem with so much public discourse is it's done in abstract nouns. And I remember my great contribution at Cambridge when I was a young man was to point out that the history I was taught was a history of abstract nouns. I had classes, in the sense of social classes. I had capitalism, I had communism, all charging around in this landscape. Like there's that wonderful phrase in Bertie Wooster, like aunt calling to aunt, like brontosauruses across the primeval swamp. All these abstract nouns, but ideas only matter if a human being espouses them. You have to put the human back. You have simply to put the human back into all of this. You have to put the instance, the specificity back into all of this. So if we want to understand why expert rule is so bad, go to COVID. We were all ruled by various forms of expert committee. In this country, it was even given a Platonic name. It was SAGE, Scientific Advisory something or another committee, and it had some genuine sages on it. It had Patrick Nurse, the highly distinguished, I can't remember, some form of cell biologist Nobel Prize winner. It had absolute charlatans and frauds on it as well, like Neil Ferguson of Imperial College, who is the one who invents all the false statistics, and was already catastrophically wrong about BSE and foot and mouth. But ladies and gentlemen, that committee had a single purpose. It was to stop anybody dying of COVID. Now that sounds in one sense perfectly reasonable, but on the other hand, they took the spectacular decision. It was so important to stop anybody dying of COVID, but it didn't matter if they died of cancer or heart disease. And you shut down the NHS ceased to be a national health service and became a national COVID service. When COVID was really it wasn't a flu, but its actual death toll was no worse than many a dose of flu. You not only do that, you decide, and by the way, well, this is not as elderly as most of the groups that I've been speaking to recently, where I feel quite frisky. But you may remember. Does anybody here remember the approximate average age of death from COVID? 82. What's the average age of death in Britain? 81. So my campaign was get COVID, live longer, which unfortunately didn't take off. But the sheer absurdity, and we did, again, groups who were guaranteed almost to not get it, like school children, their education was wrecked for 3 generations of school children. And to do all this, to furlough people, we incurred costs of the same scale as a medium-sized war. We also deprive people of the need to go to work. And they've decided they're not going to bother. A very large part of the population has decided, as apparently money rains like manna from heaven, they won't go back. So we can see the appalling consequences of rule by a single expert committee. This is why we used to have a cabinet. You need to weigh things against each other. It's why Churchill and Teddy Roosevelt vie for the authorship of a wonderful saying, you want scientists, experts, on tap, but not on top. So one half of that story is the story of the rise of the expert. The other half of the story is the rise of law. The dominance, some of you, is anybody here actually an American? I don't think, no, right. Are you familiar with a Supreme Court judge called Coney Barrett, who is one of the appointees, one of the Trump appointees, and seems to be an extraordinarily able and intelligent woman. And she had a battle with one of the Democrat appointees to the Supreme Court. She wrote a devastating counter judgment, and clearly the woman is a DI appointment, is thick as 2 short planks, as we used to say. But she pointed out that this woman criticized an imperial presidency and wanted to replace it with an imperial judiciary. And what we've seen increasingly in the Anglo-Saxon world is the emergence of an imperial judiciary. This is precisely what happened in Britain, and there are 2 vehicles by which it is done. The first, and again, it's this business of words, human rights. the great which is the great flag flyer of international liberalism, the idea of human rights. Again, it sounds so lovely, doesn't it? I always say it's a Paddington Bear idea. You can see it with a little red hat on. You can see it with a little pathetic luggage label round its neck and a sweet little battered suitcase and saying, "I come from Peru," and sitting on a little bench. And particularly, you'll forgive me, ladies, every woman sort of oozes in the most surprising places with compassion. And it's a disaster. It is a catastrophe, because let's actually look what the idea of human rights law really is. I've described the law, traditional view of law in England and the other, again given to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and first of all, of course, to America itself. It's this thing that is made by the community for itself. But what is the source of power of international human rights or European universal human rights? It's outside the state. It's outside the community. It's not subject to the control of the community. And this, of course, is absolutely catastrophic, because if you bother to think about it also, it means if there are universal human rights, it means there's a universal human being. There's a human being that exists outside history, outside time, outside place, outside language, outside tradition, outside culture. It means that states shouldn't exist. It means there shouldn't be frontiers. It means that everybody's got a right to live wherever they want. And you know what? That actually powers pretty much the whole of the liberal position on immigration. And we need to understand that's the origin of it. And the catastrophe in Britain, of course, is we introduce these vague ideas, the incredibly vaguely worded text of the European Convention on Human Rights, into a common law tradition. This is the first time a detailed declaration of human rights has been introduced into a common law tradition. Because remember, America doesn't have it. The American Bill of Rights is not the equivalent of the French or the European Declaration of Human Rights. The American Bill of Rights is merely a restatement of standard common law protections, completely different. Totally, although it's so easy to confuse the language of the two, it's radically, radically different. And we can see how all of this leads to this profound disturbance of the common law tradition. And interestingly enough, you referred to Burke. A near contemporary of Burke is the great jurist and legal theoretician and political philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. And in the same way that Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution is one of the founding texts of conservatism, although it's written by a Whig, Jeremy Bentham's attack on universal human rights, called Anarchical Fallacies, never has been regarded as a classic. But now we've actually tried since 1998 to incorporate the convention into an Anglo-Saxon legal system. You can see everything he said has been, all the predictions he made about it being divisive, that it sets groups against groups and so on, they've all been fulfilled. But the most devastating, as it were, aspect of it was summarized by the man who is most responsible for its introduction into English law, who is a man called Tom Bingham, who was the last law lord before the invention, the last senior law lord before they became an imperial judiciary in the form of the Supreme Court. And Bingham, interestingly enough, in a lecture in Australia, tells the truth about human rights law. He says, quite frankly, and in explicit language, the following: human rights law is anti-democratic. It is counter-majoritarian, and it is designed to protect minorities against the majority. It's completely explicit. He even lists the minorities that it's designed to protect, beginning with the mentally sick. Hence de Carlos Brown, or whatever he was called. Hence Ruda Cabana in this country. These are not accidents. They are intrinsic to the process. And then the second aspect of the thing, and I'm very aware of the clock ticking by, we formally express the supremacy of the judiciary in Britain by the extraordinary creation of a Supreme Court. How you can have a Supreme Court alongside a sovereign parliament is deranged. And the result is we now have a fundamental conflict between the two central principles of judicial supremacy and parliamentary sovereignty. And so what we've done, what we did from 1997 onwards was effectively to overlay the traditional Anglo-Saxon constitution with what you might expect to be the constitution of a newly enfranchised minor ex-Soviet republic somewhere in Central Asia. And we are reaping the appalling consequences of this, because of course what is characteristic of the judiciary, what is characteristic of the civil service, what is characteristic of the academic class, what is characteristic of the members of the quangos, they all subscribe to all the poisonous noble lies. They all subscribe to the noble lie of multiculturalism, all subscribe to the noble lie of global warming, all subscribe to the noble lie of diversity, equality, and inclusion, all subscribe to, above all, the maddest of them all, to transgenderism. Because you see, the key point, and I will stop with this, I've talked about the left and how it's captured language, but the only thing the left has captured is language. In other words, the left is a series of magical formulae which do not correspond to reality. As we all know, the left actually believes if I stand up and say here, I am a woman, I become one. Now, there's one area where this, if you're a believer, does happen. It's called transubstantiation. But that's a miracle. It's not outside this world. The body and the elements on the altar, the bread and the wine, if you pronounce hoc est corpus, if you are a believing Catholic, somehow, in the Middle Ages, they believed literally. There were pictures of the host bleeding and so on. Nowadays, it tends to be, as it were, within the mind of the believer. But the left is essentially a series of absurd dogmatic statements that don't correspond to reality. Facts are conservative. The reality is conservative. We've got to persuade everybody else of the fact. Thank you.